Annie, the older of the two, this is a musical from the 1970s. It started locally, but it moved soon to Broadway in 1977. It had a Broadway premiere, of course, winning the most important Tonys: Best Musical, Best Original Score, Best Book. The music is by a guy called Charles Strauss, and the lyrics by Martin Charmin. It's based on a literary source, not a very typical literary source, but a comic strip, quite popular thing in America. You have such short cyclical comics in newspapers. This one was called Little Orphan Annie, and it's about a very cheerful little girl who never loses hope, even though she's a poor orphan. And in the musical, that's precisely that. We have a story of a little orphan girl. She is 11. The story, importantly, is set in the 1930s, so during the time of very deep economic crisis in America. Annie is living in an orphanage or a foster home for little girls. She, as many young orphans, think of Cosette, and especially about Oliver, dreams of finding love, of finding a family. She has a dream that her parents had to leave her in this house because they were too poor to keep her. They had to work, and they will return for her. They will come to collect her, and she will be happy. So far she's not happy, but if we really, I think that the plot of Annie owes a lot to Oliver. This was a kind of reaction to Oliver, perhaps. But if Oliver was very dark, especially in the beginning when we have this scene with starving children in the workhouse, and then we have the criminal underworld, we have Oliver being basically sold into slavery to work for the undertaker. Here, the abuse that Annie and her foster sisters have to suffer is not as tragic, is not as severe. They are not starved, they are not tortured. However, one of the first moments that you remember, if you watch the film version, this is basically opening of the musical. A very popular, very famous song from this musical. It's the Hard Knock Life. It's basically a kind of anthem sung by those girls that they are suffering. They are mistreated, they are abused. Of course, if we take time to notice the nature of this mistreatment and abuse, it's not as dramatic as starvation in the workhouse that we encountered in Oliver. Well, they have to clean the house in which they live. So yes, well, hard knock life, yes, of course, but especially the psychological needs of these children are not met, and they mostly suffer from neglect. It's not really some sort of physical abuse, but emotional neglect. They are unloved, they are unwanted, and of course a very colorful villain in this musical is Miss Harridan, the caretaker. Miss Harrigan, the caretaker of the foster home, who is over the top. She is a very embittered woman, middle-aged woman. She could be more or less attractive if you watched different versions of this musical. She could be anyone from Cameron Diaz to Kathy Bates. So her exact age and looks are not that important. What is important is that she is quite embittered. She had ambitions. She wanted to be a musician. She wanted to be a rock star in some versions. But of course it never materialized. She is lonely and she would like to have a partner. But all the men that are interested in her are not really that attractive to her. And first and foremost, she hates her job. She absolutely hates her job. There is a funny villain song that she sings about little girls, which is, of course, the exposition of how she hates little girls and how she would like to murder them, and she has to work with them every day. So she's really a woman who lost her way in life, and she's alcoholic on top of that. Also, she's mostly drunk all of the time. So this is perhaps the hard knock life. This is the life that is not a good environment for a little girl to grow. So Annie tries to escape. This is something she does. She likes just wandering the streets of New York, and once she rescues a dog. So we have something quite interesting, and again a theme which will be important in this entire musical, and which is, I think, a kind of good motto in life. If you want to be helped, if you need help, try to help somebody who's worse off than you. First Annie rescues a stray dog, and that's the first good thing she does. And then luck smiles on her, because there is an extremely rich businessman, Mr. Warbucks, a billionaire, who wants to run for a political office, and he needs a little public relations stunt, so he decides to rent an orphan for Christmas, to invite a poor child for Christmas, for a few days, to live in his mansion, to visit him, so that it can be observed by television and the media, and basically this is something that will probably improve his public relations and help him run for office. So of course we have some sort of coincidences. Anyway, he ends up choosing Annie and her dog, and you may imagine what happens then, at least in this subplot. Of course, he is first quite reluctant, because Annie is such a lively child, and she is a bit of a troublemaker, but in the end Mr. Warbucks doesn't want to part with her. He adopts her. This is also something which is, I think, a very interesting take on a similar subject that we encountered in Oliver, namely, is Annie really an orphan? Will there be a kindly relative, or perhaps the parents themselves, coming back and claiming the child? If you remember in Oliver, this was exactly the case. The kindly older gentleman who adopted him turned out to be his relative. So it was the blood speaking. And interestingly, there is no such theme in Annie. There is a whole subplot, especially in the second act, with Miss Hannigan trying to orchestrate the fraud and having some people pretend that they are Annie's parents so they can milk Mr. Warbucks for money. And that's a kind of malicious, villainous plot that, of course, finally backfires, and the villains are punished, or at least they are shamed. Miss Hannigan is not given a very harsh punishment. She repents, and she promises to be better at her job, to try and be a better caregiver to the other girls. But the parents never materialize. It turns out that she is an orphan after all. She is not looking for her lost relatives because there are no lost relatives to be found. But by that time, she has Mr. Warbucks and his faithful secretary, the very kindly person in the mansion, and of course the two surrogate or foster parents. Grace, the secretary, and the billionaire businessman get together, and they create the family for Annie. Towards the end of the musical, there is an important political connection or kind of historical connection. Annie goes to Washington to meet President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. So it's not only a story set in a very private sphere about a poor child looking for love, looking for family, but the hopeful attitude of Annie. And of course, we have a big showstopper. We have a big song, really, in this musical. The song that has been covered by many artists many times, and I mean the song "Tomorrow." So we have at least two, perhaps more, probably more. Memorable songs in this musical, but arguably the most famous of them is the song "Tomorrow." So the kind of anthem of hope that everything will be better, you just need to believe everything will be fine. There is always tomorrow because it's just one day away, so hold on for one more day and it will be better. So if we take it back to the original time frame, so the 1930s and the Great Crisis, we have President Roosevelt and his New Deal, apparently inspired by Annie's tomorrow attitude. She sings the song to him, and he finds inspiration to fight the crisis, to make American politics and the American economy better, not just the private life of this one little girl. So this is one of those musicals that had multiple revivals, so lots of tours, and especially in America, but all around the world. This is one of the musicals that were really often played, and there were multiple film adaptations. So I hope you watched the 1982 film version, especially the way that Annie is presented as this little redhead girl with curly hair is very, I would say, classic. The way that Annie was presented in this comic strip. So the first film adaptation was relatively faithful to the aesthetics of the original show. Then in 1999 there was the television version with Kathy Bates. Again, they are all very interesting. They are all very worthy of your time. And the very recent one, 2014, actually broke with the 1930s context and moved the entire premise to modern life, to modern society. That's the version with Cameron Diaz as Miss Hannigan. So this is Manhattan. This is modern New York, and the interesting change is that the main character, so Annie, but also Mr. Warbucks, the billionaire, are played by black actors. So I hope you remember when we talked about Hello Dolly and the black staging of Hello Dolly, making this kind of racial utopia, so the beautiful rich town and everybody's black. I was wondering whether this was the case with Annie. Of course, here not everybody is black, and the other characters, including the secretary, so we have kind of interracial romance as well. But Annie and the billionaire are black, so it's perhaps just going against the racial stereotypes in a similar manner that we saw in Rent. So if you remember the most intellectual and educated, and also the richest characters were. Many of them were played by black actors. But there is one more thing, and I'll give you the link I found while researching this subject, and apparently there was a version of Hard Knock Life made a few years earlier by a rap artist. Quite a famous man. I'm not that much into rap music, but named Jay-Z is something I actually heard. That's Beyonce's husband, so a very rich black man, who took this song, if you remember the song sung by mistreated orphans, Hard Knock Life, and he made it into what has the subtitle Ghetto Anthem. So the lines from the musical tune are made into a kind of recurring chorus. And if you watch the video, I'll give you the link. You have a poor black neighborhood, and the black artist singing this song as the title suggests, a ghetto anthem. There is of course a lot of added lyrics, and perhaps you need to read through them to understand them because they are quite dense. But the basic idea is that perhaps making Annie black has a deeper meaning, because it's no longer little orphans, it's like whole groups in American society that are given this kind of cold treatment, and their life is as hard as an orphan's in the deepest depths of the Great Crisis. So probably this is what they had in mind. What is interesting is that once again, as there was a case with Hello Dolly, this is a pretty straightforward musical. There seems to be no hidden meanings, but if you look for them or if you wish to create them, you can. So it's not just a kind of shallow, feel-good play for children. It could be a political comment on historical reality or perhaps even contemporary reality or the racial relations in America. So this is perhaps a good example of a musical about children and predominantly for children that has attracted some adult interest. So it could be reinterpreted creatively to focus on more serious problems. And now let's move on to Matilda.